All right, we're letting everyone in, and this meeting
Well, since I
will
can't
let.
hear anyone, I feel bad. Sorry, I don't know why. Must be something on my side. I wonder if I. Karen, can you try talking? No, you are.
Yeah, should I introduce Ryan?
I got you. I undocked my computer, so this
Oh,
I can hear you now. I don't know what's going on. Perfect.
okay,
So
perfect.
I gotta cancel IT. All right, go ahead.
All right, are we ready for the introduction then?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, well, let me just say welcome to everybody. And it's my pleasure to introduce Ryan Harrod, who apparently he's either lying on his CV, but then his kids are lying as well by growing up too fast. He graduated in 2013. I swear it was just a couple years ago, but
I know.
why on Facebook I see these tall children you now have as opposed to the little ones who are here. So this is Ryan Garrett. He got his PhD with us in 2013 under Deb Martin, of course, who can't be here today. After that, he left and was a professor at the University of Alaska at Anchorage, and he is now serving as the Dean of Academic Affairs and Chief Academic Officer at Garrett College. It's pretty typical for us to go over the publications and record. And let me just say, he has more publications than I have fingers and toes. So I didn't count them up, quite a few, but he has 4 books and another one that he's working on in preparation right now. He has lots of journal articles and book articles, including from such of our major journals as Cambridge Archaeological Journal, International Journal of Osteology, Journal of Archaeological Science, and Kiva. So he has been busy publishing for the last many years. And today he is going to talk to us about the bioarchaeology of climate change and violence. So with that, I will let Ryan take it away.
Cool. Well, thanks. I appreciate the introduction. No, I'm super excited. Deb asked me, I'm like, oh, this would be great because when I did my prosem, this what I'm going to talk about all started back then. Deb and I were at a prosem, much like this, and talked about research ideas, and a book eventually materialized out of that. But it's been a long journey. But I was always with Deb, so it's always been fun. So basically the background for this before I get started is that Deb and I have been, at the time, there's a lot of articles coming out about climate change in Africa, climate change in South Asia, and all these things were going to cause people to go all this violence, and there's going to be death, and we're just going to have mayhem. And the problem with that is it's possible, but there's also other possibilities. People don't just become violent because climate's bad. Resource insecurity is definitely a problem, but people adapt to it. So we wanted to kind of challenge that narrative, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things where I've tried to do that over the years, highlight these places where people were violent and places where they're not. So before I do that, though, there's been a lot of books written on bioarchaeology of climate change. Gwen Robin Shug wrote the first one that I know of, and that pretty sure the first one of the literature that was out. It was her dissertation in India, looking at some of these sites. Really, it's in Pakistan. She was in the Harrod Valley, but she did stuff throughout the area and kind of looking at climate change and seeing if that model held that all the time there'd be violence. Now, Gwen did find some violence, but she also talks about other things going on. The book that Deb and I wrote, Bioarchaeology of Climate Change and Violence, Ethical Considerations, that was in 2014. We really focused on the Southwest. And then the Routledge Handbook on Bioarchaeology and Climate Change and Environmental Change is the most recent, came out last year. And it was a lot of authors, and we kind of pulled together, Gwen really pulled together research from all over the world. And Gwen and I just were at a conference in Berlin, or in Germany, not really, because we were both in our offices because of COVID, but we were in Germany. And out of that, we are thinking about, oh, you guys are in preview mode. Hold on, let me change that. Thanks, Liam. Swap that, maybe. Just gonna try to do this a different way because I think it's because I was plugged into the dock. Sharing. Better? I don't see the chat anymore. I'm assuming it's better. So anyway, oh, there. Thanks, Peter. We this new book came out, and essentially a lot of trying to move this forward, especially as climate change happens. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is some of those things that if you're working with Deb, you've probably heard her talk about these. Steve Pinker has there's all these things that we hear that are kind of these public statements about violence that are incorrect. And one of them is related to climate change. But Pinker talks about we live in the best times in the world. Everybody's getting along. We have less violence than ever in history. The problem is we have all these other structural violence issues, which is a whole different topic. But we have homelessness. We have rampant inequalities. We have issues in healthcare access, all kinds of issues. Hassang and colleagues said to be scared, temperature and violence were increasing, and that in the next 20 years, we would see these climate wars, environmental wars, all these things, which is what we're going to focus on. Chagnon gives us the Hobbesian message that tribal people were inherently violent, right? You hear that perpetuated a lot. Lots of books use that. And then Jared Diamond, he'll be in here a little bit, gave us that message that violence is how we lived in the deep past as well. But he also talks about collapse related to climate change and other things. So Gwen and I did a kind of a rebuttal to Diamond as well, because he's always linking like Chaco, for example, to this huge societal class because of climate change, but there's lots of other factors if you work in that area. We wrote a recent one, Gwen and I, that was with one of her undergrad students, basically, that looked at climate change and really the political ways that people use it to propagate messages that they want, or to be proponents for certain propaganda, right? And Jane Dykstra edited this volume, but it was Bioarchaeologists Speak Out. And it was really taking to task some of these kind of ways they misuse our data, right? And that's our fault. Like, we put out data, we put out these publications, maybe somebody like Christy Turner that talks about cannibalism, and then that gets perpetuated into cannibalism in the Southwest, right? We're responsible for the message that gets put out there. So that was part of our responsibility to counter that message. And in this one, we just really tried to take away the deterministic thinking. Now, I mentioned that Gwen and I, after that conference in Germany, we're going to work on something. One of the things we'd like to do is write a popular book that does some of this, because people don't read our academic books as much, right? I mean, they read them, but maybe you guys in a Proseminar might read this chapter, but maybe Uncle Bob won't, right? We want to get a book that somebody might pick up and read that would really kind of highlight the truth behind some of the climate change, and what we can know and not know, right? Because there are limitations. Gwen let me borrow this slide. She used it to kind of set up a talk she was doing, but these are the sustainable goals that were put forth by World Health Organization and others that are looking at what we could do. But number 16 is peace, justice, and strong institutions. That's where we're focused, is on this idea of the research priority of peace, justice, and strong institutions. How do we start to understand this in the world, right? When we look at climate change, when we look at global development, what do we see happening? Are people inherently going to be more violent? Are people going to resort to conflict in different areas because there's a resource shortage? Or are they going to cooperate and do things that could benefit more people, right? And that's where hopefully we'll try to argue that you see that. Just to give you an idea, I mean, I study violence. Deb Martin has as well for a long time, but both of us use that. I'm sure she's told you about the two sides of a coin, but peace is often the other side of the coin. But that analogy works for me, but it doesn't work for me because I actually think we're inherently more peaceful than we are violent. If Alyssa was here, we read Sarah Hurdy's Mothers and Others, but that second chapter, that's Apes on a Plane. That one always sticks with me because her little analogy of what would happen with apes on a plane if we were all together. I think she's right? You probably wouldn't have very many apes at the end, but humans can sit next to somebody on a plane, have a disagreement, not like them. We still are inherently peaceful. We don't like them, but we're peaceful. So that picture of Deb with other grad students, Anna, I know, did a talk already. Katie Bastian is another UNLV grad. This is us during COVID outside, not as socially distanced maybe as possible. Deb might not like that. Anyway, ignore that. It's post-COVID, it's pre-COVID. We were at Santa Fe, but together because we were doing some research on the Southwest. But just how collaborative everything is. So we've always collaborated on a lot of projects four of us and others, Cheryl Anderson, Katie, and I are working on another publication. But just keep in mind that I think humans are inherently peaceful. And this is just me thinking about what Deb and I started and published in 2014 and how we kept it going. 2017, when I was teaching my class on climate change, I had this article up because this is the kind of stuff that gets put in the news. 15 trampled to death in a stampede for flour in drought-stricken Morocco, right? Obviously, that's climate change. They don't have enough water. People need water security. But the highlighting of the people that died at a point where probably a lot of stress going on. And we can always take snapshots of violence and use that to propagate the message that things are bad. Sure, you can find a dozen more cases in Morocco where people were sharing resources and water and partitioning food, but that's not necessarily what makes the news. Same up here with this news article from Fox, or the book Climate Wars, or if you're really feeling like you want to watch some really antiquated stuff, you could watch The Lost People of Chaco Canyon. It's narrated by Leonard Nimoy. It's like my only connection to Star Trek that I can think of in my research. But I did do a Star Trek lecture once that kind of tied in anthropology, so I used that. But these ideas that climate change is going to equal bad things and all the way in the past. Just a quick side note again, violence is complex. This is a kind of a PowerPoint slide that I borrowed from Deb many years ago, but it's relational. Violent acts are not random. We can usually try to find a motivation behind them. It's basically what Deb and I have spent our careers trying to do. It has meaning and rationality to it. We look to see why people maybe engage in violent acts, what it does, what it solves. It can solve problems, right? That sounds a horrible thing to say, but that's usually part of what's behind it. Violence is never an isolated act. It nearly always has some deeper history. There's long trajectories of conflict in an area before you have genocide. It's not always just, it's not an overnight thing. There's been longstanding tensions based on religion or race, or, although I don't believe race is real, but you know what I mean, or any other type of demographic factor that's been there for a long time. People have spent years kind of fighting over, and then something bad happens. And it's a force for creating and destroying individual and community identities. Anna probably talked about Animus La Plata or Sacred Ridge, and what that violence there was used to do for people, like what their intent was, and obviously a very violent event. But this kind of idea that we destroy individuals and community identity is part of when we think about it. So most of you have probably seen this. It's everywhere on the internet. It's the idea that when we think about violence, we often look at the direct violence. And when we actually think about violence, we should be looking at all of it, which includes structural and cultural violence. Again, I'm not going to go into that as much into this lecture, but I was at a conference once and an anthropologist told me they don't believe in structural violence. And I asked them, I was a little shocked, and I asked them what that meant. Like, what do you mean you don't believe in structural violence? And they're like, I don't think it's real. I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I don't understand. Like, I mean, I get it if you're talking about maybe like the tooth fairy, but structural violence is something you can see. Anchorage, when I was living there, had a huge homelessness problem. And it was clearly higher among certain groups. And if you were aware of it, you knew it was indigenous groups, and it was people that were coming to Anchorage, and there was structural violence in terms of racism and access to resources and all kinds of things, right? But it was clearly there. But people don't often look for that. It's the invisible violence, as Galton would say, right? But one of the things we've been focused on is trying to reveal that. There's been a lot of publications on bioarchaeology and violence. These are not all of them. One of my current grad student, who is actually at the University in Mexico, she's a PhD student. She came up to Anchorage and was basically spent a semester with me just doing violence theory for her dissertation. She kind of pulled this together. So I added a couple to update it a little bit, but you can see that people have been publishing on this topic for a very long time. And Deb Martin being one of the earliest. These were 1997 book, Troubled Times, over there. But the Embers have been talking about it for a very long time. Bioarchaeology in general, there's volume upon volume of books on the topic. Just as a little side note, a bunch of those volumes, at least half, let's say, are in series that Deb was either the editor for, or somehow she was involved, or she's in them. So you guys are really lucky to have the ability to work with her, because she's foremost expert on this topic, right? But what we've learned over the years is that it's way more complex than what we originally thought. In fact, some of Phil Walker's early research, which was great, has been challenged by people like Carlina de la Cova, where things that he thought was maybe domestic violence and wives beating or husbands beating wives turns out to be structural violence and institutionalized violence where people are in mental or poorhouses. And she was able to uncover records to help reveal some of that. So we're constantly rethinking the narrative, right? And the same is true when we link with climate change. When we're thinking about where people are doing and how they're reacting to climate change, we should always be questioning our assumptions. A little model we put together a long time ago that says bioarchaeology and climate change, we have to understand the biology part, right? Population, demography, age, sex, stature, biological profile, stress, pathology, traumatic injuries, all those things. But then we also have to have people like Karen help us with archaeological reconstruction and think about landscape and site context and really put it into perspective. In fact, Aaron Woods and I, another former student at UNLV, worked on the Fremont, and a lot of our information was actually coming from people like Karen who do the archaeology in the area and can help inform what we were looking at. Regional interaction is also very important, thinking about material culture and trade and who they're interacting with. Isolationists versus people that are very progressive traders are going to be able to, for lack of a better term, weather the storm better when there's climate change. And then the environmental factors, that's the geomorphology, climate, and animals and plants and how things are changing, right? We use the biocultural approach. I'm sure you've heard that a lot. I'm not going to spend time on it, but this is one I made with an article I did a long time ago on Chinese railroad workers, and just showing that when we think about the individual lives of a railroad worker, we think about their individual health and population health, but we also have to think about racism at the time, right? We had the Chinese Exclusion Act. We have to think about social relationships. They have very different dietary needs and things because they were able to actually import some local foods and use other things. Railroad would support it so that they could have more traditional diet. So I'm trying to get at, I guess, living conditions, neighborhoods, and then the social and economic systems at the time, right? Railroad was being built, cheap labor, you're gonna have some exploitation, risk activities, but all of that's part of that biocultural approach. And then this one's Pam Stone, last one, I promise, that I will show you. This is direct violence versus structural violence. She looks at maternal health, women's health, and she created this to kind of get at the Nancy Shepard Hughes' three bodies: the body self, the social body, and the body politic, and just how we are impacting people in violent ways, both on the body, but also social and political, right? So just keeping all this into a perspective that we're always doing this when we're talking about questions about climate change. Two case studies I wanted to do, which are completely unrelated, but there's reasons, there's logic behind this, are the historic Arctic and subarctic, and then the pre-contact Southwest. Now, the reason I'm connecting these two is because there's assumptions about both societies. I'm sorry, I was reading the chat. There's assumptions about what was happening and why there was these increase in violence in both regions, right? So first, in the Arctic, climate change is real. I don't meet a lot of people in Alaska. I mean, people, especially in any kind of education or government organization, that don't believe in climate change. It's not a lot of like believe or not believe. I mean, you can see it happening, right? We have huge floods. We have giant fires we've never had before. We have villages being lost into the sea, right? There's definite climate change. I mean, they're tracking, you can just track water levels. In Anchorage, one of the geology department was tracking the rise of the seawater, and they could 3D model it over like a decade. Retreat of glaciers, all these things are factual, right? Things that can be quantified. This is flooding and erosion, just looking at one village where we have, that's along one of the rivers where you have flooding and how it's being impacted. This one is actually up along the coast, and you can see the coastal erosion. So the Army Corps of Engineers is tracking coastal erosion, and they predict by 2053 the village, a bunch of it will be gone. A lot of the work I did in Alaska as a bioarchaeologist was because of this kind of stuff. They would be erosion, and we'd have to go recover human remains. I had a case I worked on with my grad student who was Knightsea, and we were working for the Knightsea village. So we went down to the Knightsea tribe, and there was a burial site that was eroding off into the ocean. We went down, helped recover some human remains. The archaeologist sent me a picture less than a week later, and there was a big storm, and that entire burial site was washed away into the ocean. So had we not recovered those human remains, it would have been gone. And those human remains have since been sent off to Rip and Molly for DNA analysis. They're doing isotopic analysis, and they've learned a lot. And they're connecting that DNA to living people today. So there's this amazing story that's being told, and people are asking questions that the village is driving that couldn't have happened because of climate change if it would have been just a week later, right? I'll do one more just before I go into this. This is Carla Village in 1889. I had the ability to fly out there while I was still in Alaska, and I might go back out again, even though I'm far, far away from there. This village was actually a rather large village at the time because it was a cannery. So they were bringing Chinese workers and others up to the cannery to do work. There's a bunch of Europeans buried at this site, as well as indigenous people. There's still a community here. It's smaller than it is in this picture. But that church you see sitting up on top of the ridge, Russian Orthodox Church, is fairly significant in Alaska. It's not the oldest, but it's one of the oldest ones. It's on the National Register, National Landmark. And that's that same church in the 90s, sitting on the bluff, but back away. This is the church right before they moved it this year. They lifted the entire church and moved it and set it actually down on top of burials in the cemetery, but that was just to save it. They're still looking for new land, but that's erosion within the last 10 years. And that church was about to fall off into the ocean, right? It was going to be gone. So they moved that church, and my job is to go out and survey the cemetery and make sure where we could move it and how we could. There's actually the person that built the church is buried underneath the church, so we're going to excavate that body as well. But Karlik, if you ask somebody, Karlik, if there's climate change, they're going to say yes. The river's actually changed course. Where the river lets out today is not the same place it did before, and that's part of the climate change issue. And they're losing whole pieces of this area. The runway is not very far from that church. If you look in that other picture, that's a concern too, right? That's the only way in and out besides boat. So when we look at historic and Arctic and subarctic, we know where people lived, and I've done some work out in areas, so has Liam, obviously. Dr. Frank's been out in some of the same areas. This is Hooper Bay down in the bottom corner. I just shot it when there was a rainbow. It looks really pretty and sunny, but it was like really cold. It's October when we were digging up those human remains. But that was an old village site that basically was on a beach ridge at one point. It's no longer a beach ridge, but climate change in this area. I was working with a colleague of mine who's a cultural anthropologist, and there's a lot of talk about infanticide in all of the Arctic. High rates of female infanticide. You can find popular stuff on the web. You can see all kinds of stuff people talk about. They use an example of infanticide. But one of the things we were questioning was it really infanticide because of climate and resource stress, or was it something else? So we did a little project. We're still working on some of this. We presented some of the preliminary data. But this is just a popular website that you can go to, and you can see that they just say like factual statements like, oh, they'd leave one twin outside to die in the cold, right? I did a lot of archival research. I didn't see a lot about whether you had twins, one or another, you'd always do this, but it sounds like that is always happening, right? What we're going to talk about with some of these kind of correlations that they make is that they're not truly like a cultural practice, but something else going on. You have people like Sheldon Jackson, who has statements like these, where he talks about what people are doing, and those kind of ethnographic but biased ethnographic statements kind of get perpetuated into that's what people did, right? So many Indian mothers, to save their daughters from their own wretched lives, take them out into the woods, stuff the grass into their mouths, and leave them to die, right? And then we were also talking about senilicide. So occasionally the old asked to be killed, and then they're taken stupefied with drugs, and in the midst of various incantations, bled to death. There are some ethnographic accounts of elderly people dying, but if you've ever worked in Alaska, and you can ask Dr. Frick, the respect for elders is high among a lot of indigenous communities. So it's kind of questionable that they would just be like, well, you're old now. It's time to let you go off into the snow. And, and there's a popular book that they read in the area but it's very contextualized, and actually, if you read it, deconstructs some of this stuff. But female infanticide in the Arctic coast, it was Bilicki that wrote a lot of this early research and had some data that was written about the Nisiliq up in northern Canada. So he has information about how many infanticides there are per boy, per girl, per 100 boy, 100 girls, and kind of highlights this data. And this gets used to make those kind of statements, right? There's a book called White Lies about the Inuit that addresses some of this, but we could look at places like where Dr. Frank worked when Ackerman was looking at it. They talk about girls were economically useful as children and adults, and their husbands, not their brothers, supported their parents. The very social structure of the Yupik world would seem to turn to the practice of frequent female infanticide. Sorry, I can't talk. So if we're looking at the Yupik, which are down here in Southwest Alaska, where I was in Hooper Bay, they're arguing that you don't see female infanticide. But again, it's kind of this broad Arctic, subarctic idea that they always practiced it, right? And so again, questions about if girls are valued, then you're not likely to be killing young baby girls, right? You're going to keep them around. This was my favorite. This is Michael Swenson. He was a medical doctor and a PhD that was working up in the Arctic. But he calls out one of these narratives. He's to the editor. He talks about Dr. Shah. He says in his recent article, Peace of Mind, 5 miles from tomorrow, he describes an elderly Inuit man who was seen at our clinic and who was said to end his life by walking into the ocean. I remember well Shah's medical student rotation with us last year. I enjoyed the week that we spent together. As his supervising physician during that week, I believe that his story deserves a response. And he goes on to say it's not true, right? This guy went to Alaska for a week, wrote a story about some elder that he said walked off into the ocean, right? Put it out in a journal. No data, no facts. And this is an indigenous doctor responding to this story, right? Not a true story. So we have these kind of narratives. But again, the reason I'm talking about this with climate change is these are often talked about, especially in resource stress periods, when there's periods where there's not enough food for everyone, you got to kill somebody off, right? Whether it's the baby or the elderly, right? Survival of the fittest, for lack of a better term. These are pictures by Hrdlichka, but 1928 of an elderly woman in St. Lawrence Island and a mother and child in Siberia, right? Both groups. You can see that young children are highly valued, elderly are valued. And I only show the pictures because these pictures are just to highlight that, we forget when we talk about data that these are people. And then when you work with and know Indigenous elders and Indigenous people, you realize that there's likely that this is not a strong practice that is universal, because you don't see it today and you don't see it in the way that it's described, right? And just with that Arctic example, one of the things we take away is that the reality with all that, and now moving to the Southwest, is that those rates of high infanticide are correlated more closely with colonization than they are with environmental change. That's the period when people are whaling in the north. It's the period when diseases are coming through. It's the period when they're already under stress. I mean, you can read some of the very early ethnographic stuff and they'll talk about how much stress is already in a community that was, by the time the explorers up there, Kubalin is an example that you could read. He kind of goes into some of that. But what we see is not climate change driving violence and that people are doing these things. It's other things happening, right? There's a breakdown in social organization. There's a breakdown in traditional ways of life. And you have these kind of upticks in levels of violence. So in the Southwest, it's really hard to get that same information, right? And that's why I started with the ethnographic. But the ethnographic, I can give you examples where you can read accounts from Indigenous people and accounts from Europeans that basically dispute some of the accounts that people are arguing for, right? We go back to AD, 926. I can't really give you those same accounts. We have to infer a little bit more, right? But when we look at the Southwest, we definitely know there's droughts. Before Linda Cordell passed away, Deb and I had the opportunity to go we were sitting in her kitchen in Santa Fe drinking coffee. And so Deb's quoted this a lot, but Linda said that there's basically a drought a minute in the Southwest. People have been experiencing droughts all the time. So it's not unheard of. Now, definitely at 1200s, there's a series of mini droughts, and the Great Drought, that's a really stressful period. People are gonna have to do something more dramatic, but to assume that they didn't know that a drought would be bad and they wouldn't have some way to figure that out is not giving enough credit. And this map just shows you droughts being tracked over time. So 926, there's droughts, and you can see the Southwest impacted in 1026. And it's just the aridity of the area at the time. And it's definitely worse a little bit later in time. And then it's going to be worse again, according to the projections, right? The mega drought's supposed to be coming, which is right here. Borrowing from the future, what emerging mega drought means from the Southwest, right? And again, some of these accounts talk about violence and what's going to happen. People are going to die. Everything's going to end, right? Kind of that apocalyptic type thing. And the projections are that it's going to be one of the worst droughts we've had. So, luck Las Vegas. No, I'm kidding. If you go to Hoover Dam, or you guys probably see the water lower than what it was. It's definitely water dropping, but how do we respond, right? I always use this one in every presentation I do. This is Crow Canyon. They did a great job of just showing the people, but that's like my research has always been about reconstructing people in the past. I talk about violence, but I talk about violence and how it affects individuals, right? I care about like who they were, reconstructing identity. Most of my research in Alaska, sometimes I do population level studies, but most of it has been individual cases that I worked on for either, say, the medical examiner has found something, or I was called out to Hooper Bay to work on a couple of burials that were uncovered. And it's always reconstructing who they were. Sometimes we run DNA because a lot of the indigenous groups in Alaska are more receptive because there's been a lot of work to try to rebuild some of those relationships. We recently sent off 2 samples from a Yupik site upriver that is, it's called Aniak, but it's a 1,000-year-old set of burials. We got some radiocarbon dates back already, and then they're currently running DNA on those for me at the University of Kansas. And then the next step is to go back out to Aniak, take some hair samples and other samples, maybe just spit swabs. I don't know what they're going to use. Jennifer Aff will take some samples and compare the ancient DNA to the living DNA. But we're basically trying to reconstruct who those 2 individuals were. And there was a juvenile, but not enough DNA from the juvenile to do that, but get some information. And that's what they care about, right? They want to know that stuff. But all of our population studies, I always remind myself that's what people care about. Who are these people? This is Tim Kohler in an old article, but just kind of what some of the data we might look at if we're going to look at climate change, right? We're going to look at population estimates. So he's looking at population estimates. They're growing up at 1200s and there's a drastic decline. Percentage in a village, kind of estimate some of that. For my sites, Luxon has done a lot of that work, Steve Luxon. Incidents of warfare, this is going to be the Bioarch data oftentimes. Sometimes it's based off of projectile points or other things that might be in the area, depending if they can link that to warfare. That's kind of tricky. Number of wild animal or game that's available, right? Zooarchaeology coming into play here. So if you're taking classes with Levent, this might be the area you're thinking of. And then average potential corn yield, looking at the maize. A lot of people have been running DNA analysis on the maize recently. That's pretty cool. It's given us a lot more information. But looking at how these things are all interacting together and leading to it. But reason I show this is because this is talking about drought may be the trigger, but it's not the cause of a collapse of an empire. I like that because it's a lot of factors, but this is only adding in the factors we might look at for a site, not the people, right? Once we start adding in people's reactions or ideologies about violence, it's way more complex. At the Germany conference, it was kind of funny because we were actually together. Karl Reinhardt was presenting right before I did. So I was like, Karl, I hope you don't mind I'm using this. He's like, oh, that's really old. Why can't be updated? He's like, no, I just use the same one. Anyway, this is some of the parasitology work he's done in the area, looking at coprolites. They're continuing to do that research. They've updated it. They have some new articles out. He sent me one that's in press right now. But this image, I just like the visual aspect of it. But when you have climate change, one thing that you might have higher levels of is parasites, right? I mean, if you don't have fresh water, you don't have clean water, you can see parasites. And I just show you up here, this was looking at 2005 and 1916 and comparing it to 1989. The Guinean worm disease had been on the decline. They were nearly wiped out. And then it started to rise again when there was areas where people were drinking basically like not potable water, right? And they had lots of parasites and all these other things. And you have a reemergence of that disease, right? So these kind of periods of waxing and waning. But when we think about stress and some of the things, we have to add in parasites, we have to add in disease, all the other things would be affecting people in the area, right? So conflict in the Southwest, spent my entire PhD working on this. I had to write I don't know if you guys still do that, in research class, I had to write my NSF grant proposal for looking at this information. But there's a ton of work done on violence in the Southwest, right? Tim White, did prehistoric cannibalism in Mancos. You have Anna and others doing Sacred Ridge and Animus La Plata. And then you have the whole Mancorn thing, right? Which is, anyway, I don't know, cannibalism or violence. It's always been talked about in the Southwest. A lot of people are focused on it. In fact, we just did a documentary down in Night Horse Reservoir down in Durango, Colorado, and they continually want us to talk about trophy taking, decapitation, or cannibalism. And I tend not to talk about cannibalism because I don't think there's a lot of great evidence for it. I know there's one coprolite, but Karl doesn't think it's great evidence. So anyway, until we have more evidence, there's violence for sure. I don't know what the motivation behind the violence is. I don't know what it means, but I'll talk about some possibilities. We know there's complexity in the area. You can go to Pueblo Bonito or Aztec Ruin. Those are both large, complex sites. They're related to one another. Alexan and Cameron looked at that, but Van Dyke as well. Ruth Van Dyke has done a ton of work on that. She still does. She has grad students working on that. So there's lots of these connections there. Erin Baxter just did a wonderful reconstruction of Aztec ruins where she looked at Morris's notes and kind of tried to put all the people back in using just old photographs, right? Which is cool because then my skeletal data from there, we kind of get to correlate it, and it's really interesting to see. Morris was not the world's greatest skeletal biologist, right? Obviously, it was 1930s and he was an archaeologist. So extreme processing in the U.S. Southwest. If you're in Deb's class, it's kind of been her focus lately, massacres and extreme processing. Anna Osterholtz has done a ton of work on that. So has Ventura Perez, who's pictured up there. Ventura did his work at Penasco Blanco in Chaco Canyon. And one of the interesting things is when Christy Turner was arguing for cannibalism, Ventura looked at the same bones and tried to see what it looked like. And he will argue that it looks more like defleshing after they're dead. And there's reasons why, cut marks and all that stuff. But he doesn't think it's cannibalism. I think he's arguing still for ancestor veneration, some sort of body manipulation type thing, which has a whole different meaning, right? Might not sell as many newspapers, but definitely has a whole different meaning than cannibalism. So just kind of challenging these things. But regardless of what's happening, we know there's these events, these extreme processing events in the Southwest. Now, they've often been linked to climate change, and that's kind of where we're going to look at it. Deb and I recently took all these extreme processing sites and mapped them out and then put them on a timeline. And what she's arguing, and it's valid, if you look at, this is Lexon's original 2002 War in the Southwest model at the bottom, warfare, then there's raiding and feuding, then there's peace, and there's war. But if you look at the extreme processing sites just in all the area, it doesn't look like it changes very much over time. They're basically examples of each one of these through time, right? So we don't have periods. Now, Cave 7 might be debated. We could leave that one out. It's early. Sacred Ridge, and it's got pretty good data on that. They got really good control. Some of these others are pretty good control. There's a couple others that aren't mentioned in here. There's one that's not on here because it's done by kind of an avocational anthropologist. But regardless, we seem to see that it happens in the Southwest in different areas, and it's not really contained by any necessary temporal period, right? So we looked at some other options that Andy Darling had already talked about. Bill Walker has mentioned witches in the Southwest, but we are looking at that climate change witch execution connection. That this is a chapter in Gwen's book, but that picture on the side is from Cushing. It's Zuni culture is killing a witch, and he's drawn the picture of it. I just digitized it, kind of revised a little bit, and then added in this quote from Cushing that says, in Zuni law and customs, there are but two crimes punishable by death: sorcery and cowardness in battle. And then in the group, we talk a lot about witches and what they are linked with, and witches are linked with war in one example. So you might kill a witch, or sorry, war, I said war. Climate, I'm sorry, weather and climate. Witches are linked in some cultures to weather and climate. And if weather's bad, you might kill the witch and hope the weather gets better, right? So that's climate and violence together, but it's not the same climate and violence that Hastings and colleagues are talking about, right? We're not talking about there's not enough resources so people kill each other. We're talking about things aren't going the way you thought they should go, so you're killing the one that you think is causing the problem, right? That's a very different social kind of religious aspect to it all, right? Ideology of some sort. Witchcraft killing and peaks of it in correlation to climate change is not a new concept. They've looked at this in Europe. I've been to conferences with some of these people, and we've kind of compared some things. There was one in Iceland that was looking at similar things, but witches are seen in a lot of cultures as able to control things. And if you can control, manipulate things like the weather, and weather's bad, or disease, and disease is bad, you can. I was doing this talk, and while I was there, one of my colleagues who studies plague in Europe was also there, and she was kind of in the chat, kind of like Peter was a minute ago. And I would be like, oh, if you want to really talk about correlations of violence with things like disease, you should ask her. And she was like, absolutely. So it's really nice having lots of people there, because when I said these statements, I had people that could back me up. But we know that these correlations can be there, but is it climate change causing people to kill each other, or is it climate change causing already superstition that's already there that you might already be doing to ramp up, right? Climate and witch murder through time is not is around. Like I said, this is the Norway witch trials, a woman killed for a fatal storm. This is a recent archaeological reconstruction in Verado. But in Tanzania, they also have, when harvest is bad due to droughts or flood, the food is scarce, the murder of witches, almost always old women, is twice as likely to occur as in normal years. So witches are sometimes demographically based. Sometimes there's lineages of witches. It really depends on the culture that you're looking at. And when we're reconstructing these events, that's what we're trying to understand. And in that chapter, we kind of looked at some of the Southwest. We used stuff from Parsons and stuff from Malotic, and just tried to reconstruct what people talked about when there was witches and violence. We actually used some Dene cultural history as well, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, my thesis is about social control and in the Southwest. And the reason I use that is because I was interested in why Lexington calls Chaco, Pax Chaco, this peaceful period, this time when nobody's fighting and there was that extreme violence. You saw that chart earlier. And then there's a period where there's no violence, and then it gets bad again. And I argued for social control because, like Gwen had found in the Harappan Valley, that there was a period where it looks like people are kind of controlling things and things are happy. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's socially, politically on par with one another. It doesn't mean everything's great. There's still violence. I mean, Chaco Canyon, I find lots of evidence of non-lethal violence. It's just the lethal violence was much lower. So why that is maybe it's being controlled by religion. It's being controlled by elites, like Lexi might argue. But it's a process of just maintaining orderly life in populations. We do this with police, and it works and doesn't work, right? Black Lives Matter obviously shows us there's major issues with that. We use it with prison systems. We have institutionalized social control. Some people have just normative behaviors that they use, religious practices. So culturally defined practices that ensure people follow the rules and exist to ensure social, political, and cultural cohesion. And I just have the kivas highlighted because of the religious aspect of them. I'm sure if you're in Bob Ross' class or you've taken stuff with her, she talks a lot about these ceremonial structures. But this idea that maybe these were that the establishment of the Pueblo II traditions and some of these things like this Chaco phenomenon that Steve Lexon says might have been social control that dampened down the violence. And again, I'm not the first one to say this. I just looked at the bioarchaeological data to say, yeah, it seems to support some of that, right? So, and Steve LeBlanc called it Pax with a twist, right? That it was peaceful, but then every once in a while they still kill people for various reasons. And that's some of the research that Ventura Perez kind of looks at. So there's my book, Bioarchaeology and Social Control. But really, I was looking at cooperation and conflict. And I should put cooperation first in hindsight, because to build all that Pueblo II structures and to have that society as massive as that and to have all that group cohesion, that would have taken more cooperation than conflict, right? But really, I was, again, focused on violence. This is just me at Pueblo Bonito. When, like Karen said, when the kids were little, I had one picture of my son in here. He was maybe 6, 7, and now he's like 16, 17. And he's taller than me, so there's that. We came up with a model, environmental change. How does it lead to violence? It's convoluted, but that's the way it should be. And in fact, at the conference this December, the one question I got is like, well, if it's a convoluted model, how do we study it? I'm like, carefully. right? Like like we should be. But if it's an easy correlation, it's much simpler to say, hey, climate change caused violence, right? If you know anything about dating in the Southwest, we can use dendrochronology to get really precise dates on some things, like say a building, perhaps. But with a body, we might be using radiocarbon dates, which have a much wider range. And oftentimes, though, even though you have these two dates that aren't quite the same, people will correlate them together like, hey, these are the same. Maybe the drought happened 10 years earlier, maybe 10 years later than when that person experienced that violence. We really can't connect those two things quite as close as we think we can, right? It's a lot of correlation. So environmental change, we say temperature change, precipitation change, soil and fertility, carrying capacity. These are all the arguments for things that cause people to either migrate or to experience episodes of violence. And they're all true. I mean, these are all things we think about today, right? We have to have available soil to grow food. You have to have enough water. You don't want super drought. That's bad. And you don't want to have too many people in one area. But there are responses, cultural and biological. Cultural response might be like maybe you share some resources, you redistribute water access, whatever. Biological is going to be a response. You need those things. Political instability and economic instability might lead to violence for sure, or migration. And political integration and economic stability might lead to periods of peace where you weather the storm, right? And that's one of the things we were looking at is just thinking about examples where people have these. And there are definite examples. There are places in the world where there are extreme cases of climate change and people are resilient to that climate change and they stay there, and societies don't necessarily thrive, but they make it through and then they build afterwards, right? So, and there's more recent examples too. There's Zhang et al. Looked at China, and Toll and Wagner looked at Europe, and they looked over the last 1,000 years in both continents and tried to see how people reacted to climate change. And during similar periods of extreme climate change, one area did better than the other. And it really came down to technology advancement. That one area was able to change some technology, allowed them to basically till the soil and do some other things that made it fertile again. So they were able to adapt to that climate change, right? And there wasn't an example of large scale conflict. The other place did. Climate disasters are not going away. We are going to have climate disasters for foreseeable future, probably. My friends that are working in Alaska and working in California that are geologists and foresters and geographers, there's just going to be more and more of the fires that have happened in the area. And I know UNLV was involved with helping Reno when the fire happened a few years ago, but those kind of things are going to continue to happen. My new school, I'm the dean of academics. I have to think about programs and what programs are we going to have, which ones are we going to cancel. We have a program that we're questioning whether it will grow or not. The program's related. One of their main aspects is river rafting, which sounds weird in this talk, but the river rafting, we've had environmentalists have been plotting river data all over the world, or all over the US at least. And what they found is the rivers are dropping in the west and they're rising in the east. So we're like, oh, we're going to support that program, right? Because when the rivers aren't doing well in Colorado, people are going to come east and do it here, which has been the trend. In the last 10 years, that program has grown and more people are using river rafting as a hobby out in this area. That's all related to climate, right? We know these things are still shifting. It's just how do we adapt to it? In Alaska, they have all kinds of adaptations to glaciers. Oh. Maybe not. No. So I just, in terms of migration, with Chaco, I'm not the only one that argued this, but people have argued that people have essentially migrated for the most part. They left the area, moved to other areas. There's some wonderful books on the topic that you can read that have talked about language and connecting language from like the Rio Grande Valley back to places where they think they were maybe in that northern Mesa Verde region. But that definite climate change. This is Benson et al. 2007. He sent me his recent article too because he'd done some updates to it. But again, I like his old graph. But you can see these periods of like drought that happened, and eventually people do leave that area because it's a long period of drought, and they need to figure out something else, and they just move and reorganize a little bit, right? But again, these models of climate change in the Southwest are used, this nature, but NASA's used the models to kind of predict what the future will hold for places like Las Vegas and Phoenix. But we know that these events happen. It's just how do people react? And it's usually a negative reaction in the news, right? But what we're arguing with the book and what we've argued with our research is that maybe it's not always negative. Maybe there's positives to it. I mean, it's not like the Pueblo people have disappeared by any means. I mean, colonialism obviously is a different case, but you can see the migration, you can see the continuation of cultural traditions. Some of the DNA analysis that was taken on the Chaco burials, that was ethically or not ethically taken on the burials, has revealed a whole bunch of new information that will be interesting to see, and will also probably help with repatriation. But people have been fleeing or reorganizing themselves with climate change for a very long time, and they continue to do so. So in the Southwest, the conclusion to our book was, yeah, that was a major environmental impact. There was some evidence of violence, but violence was always, in those extreme processing events, at least always there. In fact, during Chaco, it was a reduction of that violence. The climate, and there was climate change during Chaco. There was periods of drought, but not as bad as in 1200s. But in the 1200s, we just suggest that people moved and reorganized themselves, but there was not necessarily evidence of widespread violence. In fact, Aztec has much less violence than Chaco does in terms of some of that. I mean, it's not a lot of violence at Aztec. At the very end, Aaron Baxter talks about burning rooms and some of that, and there's one area where there's some processing, so there's possibly a couple of events, but then that was kind of maybe related to closing the site, and then people reorganized into a new area. Displacement by conflict and disaster. Climate will be driving the major displacement in the world, according to most estimates. That's what we're going to be looking at in the future, is a lot of displacement by disasters around the world. And climate conflict, for sure, is still a part of it. But yeah, we continue to address conflict around the world. We have issues, but we continue to try to revise some of that. There's areas where there's still high rates, like Colombia or Syria, obviously, and Yemen. But these climate events are actually something that's more worrisome, right? And you can think about disease spread and some of the other things that have happened. Climate's affecting that as well. When I lived in Alaska, we have mosquitoes, but we don't have a lot of diseases. But one of the things they're predicting will be that our CDC colleague is looking at is they'll probably eventually get things like West Nile and maybe even malaria, potentially, is depending on what happens. And that's unheard of, right? Those are tropical or subtropical diseases. But things are moving up. While I was there, we started to get things that we'd never had before, like, I think, what was it? Ticks started to move into the area somewhere lower. We had fleas, some other parasitic kind of, or bugs and other things that would never been there before have moved in. Things like that were changing the context in the environment, right? And affecting people. So lots of ways that you can modify or adapt to climate change. There's direct climate changes, like a gradual climate change, people can kind of adapt to, right? There's different ways to do that, like drought or degradation, seasonal labor migration. You might just move to another area. If you're practicing seasonal round, you could like go to a different area, use that area's resources, as long as there's not people there that would prevent you from doing that. But if the people are welcoming, you have pretty good relations, you can kind of move around. Gradual climate change can be chronic disasters. So it could be that you have longer, if it's a yearly time span, it could be worse. And then sudden or gradual climate change can make people migrate. One more last example is Bill Workman, who passed away recently, who was a Emeritus faculty member, did his original idea on the White Mountain ash explosion that said that area drove the Athabascan migrations south to the Pacific and all the way down to the Southwest. There's a recent article that was put out in the paper in Canada, like maybe 6 months ago, and it's a grad student doing his dissertation that's kind of proving a lot of that, which is really cool. But anyway, I was talking to him, and he's like, "Oh yeah, that's great, all this old research." But there's also an Athabascan faculty member that she talked about that same event, but from the Athabascan oral traditions, which was really cool. And they have oral traditions that link up to that. But that might be a sudden event that caused people to move. Maybe something like Sunset Crater, right? Caused people to leave the area, but Walapi, I can talk today, came back and people established more. So do we really collapse? And do we really have these major climate change, like people like Jared said, or like the lost people of Chaco? We would question it, as others have done before us, right? Norm Yaffe was a faculty member for a period. I might still be emeritus, but he was part of questioning collapse and challenging some of these ideas. And we do the same in the Southwest. But when we think about these periods of climate change, the big thing is correlation doesn't equal causation, right? It's a much messier model. So there's those two studies in China and Europe, but essentially that there was not warfare in Europe in some places during certain times because technology allowed for increased agricultural production. Now, both of these studies are probably, in my mind, just a little problematic because they're macro evaluations. They basically cluster all the data for China, all the data for Europe. I mean, if you regionalized it and looked at some other things, you'd probably see even more nuance to that. But they were basically doing a pretty simple model of climate change, agricultural production, food supply, and frequency of war, right? Using that, still, it doesn't come out to be a universal effect that climate change equals violence. There's sampling violence or bias in climate and conflict research. This is a recent study that was done in Nature that they looked at what people mention as climate conflict literature and then compared the countries that are most exposed to risk of climate change. They're not the same countries. Like the list isn't the same, right? They're not, like the risk that they have isn't always correlating with actually the country that's experiencing the most climate change. So we've used these things, even though it's problematic. And if you're interested, I just like the approach in that article because it's not really an anthropological necessarily like looking at it. They're thinking about like what do we highlight and what is our focus, and then where are the places really impacted by the major climate change, and they're not the same necessarily. It's interesting. We wrote a little op-ed years ago with Rick Chacon, who he does a lot of ethnographic work in South America and other places, but we basically said climate change association is not causation, right? Because we can associate these two events, we can't necessarily directly correlate them, that we're make sure that they one cause the other, right? Climate change didn't cause the violence, but there are periods when there's both things are happening, but are they happening because of other things going on? And that's where I'll leave with our final model, which is where at the Germany conference, there was, I mean, they're happy, but there was like, oh man, that's harder to use. I'm like, yeah, I know. But it's better because we add more information, right? So we're looking at environmental degradation, inequality, migration, fear of unpredictable resources, ethnic and social fragmentation, climate change, and then we're thinking about violent conflict, right? And if you've been in if you've taken Deb's violence class, you probably have read some of the articles, but people kill each other over ethnic differences or fear of something or perceived an idea that somebody's causing something more often than they do for things like climate change or environmental degradation. But the focus recently has been on climate change because we can study climate change, we can quantify it, and we can say that it's happening, right? Some of the other stuff is much harder to study, and it falls outside the realm of, say, hard science into social sciences and people. It's messier, right? A messier model. It's not as easy to make those simple correlations, but that's what I would argue want to avoid, right? But since I only have 5 minutes, questions? Probably fast and a lot. You want me to stop sharing? I'll stop sharing.
Actually, it'd be useful to keep it up. Can we ask questions?
Oh yeah, I can do that.
You can hear me?
Yeah, got it.
Okay. Hi, I'm Brian Gilmore. I'm a professor here in the
Yeah.
department. And I think topic. So I was wondering if this idea that climate change is driving conflict.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say you're trying to contradict it, but you're looking at other factors that are driving this. Do you think that, like, that's what I would expect, to be honest. Like, some societies are going to be more fragile than others. And, or whatever, right? But it would still be, climate change would still be, in a sense, the ultimate cause. In other words, like the underlying driver. And so some societies are more resilient, some aren't. And so I personally wouldn't expect a one-to-one correlation in any way, but I would expect to see a statistical tendency over the long, sort of haul.
Yeah, and see, some argued, some people that have looked at the stats behind it argue that the stats aren't even that strong. I mean, it depends. It really depends on, example, let's say Rwanda in the 90s. If you had a climate change event right around that time, I'm guessing you'd probably have a uptick in violence, right? What probably would have happened anyway, but the climate's definitely going to tip that over the edge. In other places, that same climate change event might cause disruption, might cause other issues, but is it going to lead to some sort of genocide? Probably not. So would you say that climate's always leading to those things, or climate's one more factor that can push that society into that next stage? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah. So I actually, I would kind of almost look at it in the reverse of the way you are. Like, say,
Right.
Switzerland has a climate event and Rwanda has a climate event.
Right.
The wealth of Switzerland acts as a buffer. But when
Right.
the violence
Exactly.
does occur in Rwanda, we would still say that the environment is driving that. So some societies are able to resist it. But you know, it is a thing that creates competition between individuals.
Oh yeah, it definitely creates stress.
And is driving scarcity. So I guess, you know,
But
I feel like
just
it's overly, go ahead.
well, I was just gonna say, just to counter that, again, just same two factors. But if let's say there was a period of violence, but climate was great going on in Switzerland, but the economic depression happened, would you say economic depression always causes violence? Or you know what I mean? Does that
No, I wouldn't
make
say
sense?
it
Like,
always does, but it would be the driver of it.
right.
So in other words, like,
But the driver would be multiple, it's just multiple things. You know what I mean? Like you have, these are definitely all factors, but the problem in the research is that they're often like temperature increasing, because you can measure that, is going to cause some major event. And like Brian, I know like Potts was at our climate conference talking about human evolution and climate change, right? And
Yeah.
even that, he was like, it's not super simple. There's a lot of things that go into it, but yeah, definitely climate change is part of the narrative, right? Not excluding that, but that it's just more complex is all. You'd be surprised how simple people think it is all I'm saying.
right. I mean, I guess I would be surprised if I would never say, oh, it's simple one-to-one. Like my feeling is the climate
Me
is
too.
and it's someplace like the United States will have relatively
Right.
little conflict, but someplace
Right.
like Rwanda will have a lot of it, and that's because if you're rich, you can buffer it. But it still
Right.
means that the climate is applying stress to the system, and some systems just aren't robust enough to exist.
Right. And even more like that's a big macro scale, but even on a, like a smaller scale, like if you were looking at communities in Vegas and like stress, if there was an event where there was more stress, certain poverty stricken communities, but also other factors might have more issues than a wealthier gated community, right? Because you, like you said, you can buffer against it. But again, I'm not arguing that climate's not definitely not a driver. It's just that all those other factors need to be considered when you use it, and they're often not, if that makes sense. Especially in the environmental research. Environmental research is primarily focused on measuring temperature and then equating that with violence.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just like thinking of
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I love
this huge macro scale. So you have sort
right.
of no alternative other than to look for the coarser grain thing.
Right.
And of course, it's just my observation. Sometimes when you fall too deeply in, you see so many things going on. You're like, oh no,
It's harder.
You can't understand anything. This is no way we
Right.
understand a single thing. So it
Yeah.
takes that stepping back to sort of say, okay, hold on here. You know,
Right.
we need to make inferences across, you know, many, many communities in order to be able to say anything.
Right. And so back to the Southwest, one of the things is that like no two areas are the same, or two time periods, or two droughts. Do you know what I mean? Like one drought might have caused violence, one drought didn't. And it's hasn't changed that much, but there was whatever was happening. Ideologies had shifted. It was a community. Animalist La Plata, Anna's research when she was talking about that. I mean, they don't really know why that happened, but she has some ideas about potentially ideology playing a factor, but it's really hard to prove that, right? I mean, how are we gonna archaeologically, how do we show that? But she can infer that. But I guess my point being that there's other places where the same situation was going on, and they didn't have any massacre in that same general 100-mile radius. But
Yeah,
it periodically pops up. Yeah. No, but I love it. I mean, that's the point. It's just to make it, for us, it was to make it just people think about it a little bit messier. And again, I study climate change, and like I said with Gwen and Harappa, the climate pushed them over the edge. They definitely was climate induced for them. They were doing really well until that very end. But then disease also played a factor, and then society collapsed, but they really migrated and reestablished themselves somewhere else. Different model, really. But
yeah, right. I mean, I feel like you can take some sort of like in today, you can take some sort of fraction and make it so like the numerator is population density and the denominator is wealth. And the bigger that number, the more likely you are to have a violent response to something like climate change. because
Yeah.
there are these factors that are kind of pushing things, and it's a probability statement, no question.
Right, exactly. And again, not to debate that. We just started looking at making it a little more nuanced and not so much fatalistic, because it doesn't have to be that way. I didn't bring them up, but there's a couple of dissertations that have looked at sites where they have inequality and they have climate change, and there's still not that event. Instead, there's cooperation. There's a shift in like political ideology, and they basically cooperate. Now, there's other places where they kill a bunch of people.
Someone needs to bottle that first thing.
Yeah, figure out why that is the case, right? Yeah, I mean, it's just the nuances that go into some of that, right? And that's the way that all the other factors are in there. It's just really important to think about, because when we make those fatalistic statements, like Diamond does, I'm just saying, he clearly says things like collapse, or you have Hassang and colleagues. That's easier in my mind. I can run some stats and I can find two things that correlate pretty well. That makes sense.
Yeah.
This sticks with me from undergrad.
Jared Diamond's kind of like set up a big flag so everybody pay attention. So
exactly.
And he has to make these big, broad statements. And I know it irritates everybody in there.
So does Pinker. Right. Pinker does the same thing.
Yeah. But Pinker does the same thing. But I feel like in the broad scale, they're both probably right. In the most important sense. Yeah.
Well, Alan, before he retired, Alan used to always say that, he appreciated Diamond. He didn't necessarily I'm quoting him, at least from what I remember. He appreciated it because he got us to think about the topic and got everybody to talk about it.
Right. Yeah.
It's valid. Don't have to agree with it, but we could talk about it, right?
I think have we lost Peter?
Have we lost Peter?
So we are over time. We do have one question in the chat.
So go ahead.
Yeah, let's go ahead.
I love the question, by the way.
Question in the chat.
Sure.
Have you seen any association between indigenous captive networks and climate change in the American Southwest?
No. I mean, most of what we've looked at, I'm trying to think. Yeah, like Brian's saying, if you take a big picture, for sure there's going to be some of that, because the big push for indigenous people that are captives is for agricultural production. So is it necessarily climate related, to buffer climate, or to grow your society in a marginal climate would be what I would argue. So agricultural production being part of that last model I showed you, sure. That would be a motivating factor to make more product and to have more resources. The other factor is it also buffered some of the other women. There's lots of things that went into that. Again, that's the nuance, I guess. But when we look at the oral traditions of why people take captives, it was like, there's a whole bunch of factors that go into that. Some of it was an ideology. But the biggest uptick in captive taking in the Southwest is colonization. So that's definitely not climate related. That's a demographic shift.
Okay, well, we're about 10 minutes over, so I think I'm going to let you go. But
of course.
What a great talk, Ryan. I really enjoyed it. So
Thanks.
Want to thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks. And Brian, thanks for the questions. I like about.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Give some virtual class.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay. Thanks. Bye, Brian. Ryan.
See you.
Bye, Ryan, too.
Yeah.